So hi, today the main topic is how to increase the web performance. If you're like if you're like web front-end engineer like me, it's really kind of hard to figure out how to enhance the web performance. Especially, it's kind of really hard. Um, but let me try to give example of our service, which is called Roundtrick AI Code Education Platform, and this is really we really didn't launch it, but let me just try to show you. Let's just know the performance in front engine also requires some kind of like the UX thing. You have to think about user experience to think about the also performance things. Let me give you an example of this part. If you look at our website, this is really our website looks like. There's a left part in this chapter page. Left part there's like tutorial things, and right part there's a chatbot here. And when we try to refresh this kind of website, you'll be able to see this kind of skeleton. So this is also how you really increase the web performance when there's some kind of like skeleton UI of it, because the skeleton you don't really kind of, it's kind of impossible you put or you render some kind of the UI that requires API calls. Your API calls could be slow, but you have to, rather than showing the nothing, you have to show some kind of you have to show the UI that we are fetching the data, so you just have to wait it. You just have to make some kind of UI. So that is kind of a skeleton part here. And after that, if you even click and let me try to show you more. Even so, this kind of really kind of UX thing, and also when your UI, when your some kind of fetcher requires click, or if it requires some navigation, you can also think about the prefetching. The prefetching means that your target API is gonna be using in your next page. So what you have to do is, rather than if your next page is really kind of really expensive, it really requires some kind of big API and big component, a lot of JavaScript chunks. What you have to do is you fetch first on the API, because if it's like the UI that really kind of depends on the API, you really have to think about prefetching. So let me just try to delete this. So if I try to hover here, there's really kind of interesting happen. As you can see, there's an API calls here. If I hover, if user tends to like try to click this kind of card, we prefetch this API that we don't really have to call API when we even get into chapter this next page. So if you click here, of course there's gonna be skeleton here. After skeleton, so while skeleton is doing it, the API calls happen and it renders the page. So that's really simple. And thanks to and also when you go back again, there should be no skeleton because you already fetched it and you have to cache this kind of data, API data. But now a lot of library supports like caching, in-memory caching. Example, in-memory caching, that it's just caching your data, API data, in your browser, not browser, your website. So if you click here, the before there was a skeleton, but if you try to click here again, there's no skeleton up here because we already cached it, and if it requires some kind of big data and that is not gonna change, we also can do is like the caching on the local storage. So if you look at here, we cache in the local storage, and the chapters we put here, we put like this. So data here, so the reason why it is good to cache on the local storage is because this text is really dependent on the API calls. Let's just say, I think this part is, wait, I'm just gonna fetch. Is it this? Yeah, I think this is the, yeah. But normally, if there's no local storage, like if you look at this part, if there's no local storage. Oh wait, why there's no remove? If there's no local storage, no, sorry. If the the API is in this part, curriculums, so we just have to refetch. Let's try to refetch it. The reason why there's no let's just put trigger loading. So when we try to put trigger loading, so there's a bunch of skeleton, but in this page, so in this Discord is chapter page. In this page, this is really kind of expensive cost. It's really expensive because it renders the page in using it renders onto Markdown, and it put Markdown as the HTML. So let's say we're trying to trigger loading and nothing happens. So because when we're trying to render this page, we don't really renders. We renders the we renders page when we get the data. But once we already get the data, we don't really put dependent on the data. We put dependent on the cache here, local storage. So even though we remove it, there's not gonna happen. There's not gonna happen. The reason why there's not gonna happen, this UI, there's no big effect of this UI is because this UI is referencing this kind of cache value here. So which also means that user don't have to really have to wait for this kind of text data. First, user have to look at this chapter data and course API and the API data and this chapter data, trying to analyze is the data is same or not. If it's not same, you just have to just change the data, change this kind of UI. But if it's not, you just have to keep the origin one, which is rely on the local storage. And also, even next lesson button sends prefetching API and HTML. When you click it, also of course there's gonna be local storage and there's gonna be like this. So this is why I think it's really how you really enhance the web performance. Like skeleton UI and bunch of things prefetching. Also, you have to think about. This part is not really optimizing yet, because if you're trying to reload it, the API, there's waterfalls in the API. Example, I call member me, and and I call girls. Rather than doing it, I can just reduce the waterfalls, because waterfall is basically means that if your components requires API calls and your child components requires API calls, we don't really call API calls like here and here, because your child is being made by parents. So rather than doing it, prefetch this kind of API on the parents, the grandparents, and we don't have to care about some kind of waterfalls. Waterfall means that your components your API is being executed if your component is being rendered and it's executed. So there's going to be waterfalls like here and here. So I think this is it. So this kind of like how do you really enhance web performance in a real practical way. So this is it. Have a nice day. See you next time. Bye bye.